The story begins with an explosion. A blinding flash, a tremor beneath the earth, and then silence. For a moment, it feels like the end of the world. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of something that would change it. The year was 1867, and a quiet, thoughtful man named Alfred Nobel had just invented dynamite. The world would never be the same again. He was hailed as a genius, a man who tamed destruction, who turned chaos into progress. Bridges rose faster, tunnels pierced mountains, cities expanded, fortunes were made. But deep within Alfred, the noise of the explosions never faded. Each detonation seemed to echo inside his heart. He had built something powerful, yet he feared it might one day destroy everything he loved about humanity. Decades later, when the newspapers mistakenly announced his death, they printed a headline that froze his soul. "The Merchant of Death is dead." That single line changed him forever. He read his own obituary and saw how history would remember him. And so he made a decision that would change the world once more. He rewrote his legacy. He turned a fortune built from explosions into a promise for peace. And from that promise, the Nobel Prize was born, a beacon that continues to honor the best of human spirit, science, literature, medicine, and above all, peace. This is not just a story about invention or redemption. It's the story of a man wrestling with his own conscience, a man who detonated the world, only to rebuild it with hope. A man who, in silence and solitude, asked himself one question: what will they remember when I'm gone? If you've ever wondered how guilt can turn into greatness, how one mind can reshape the destiny of millions, then stay with us. Because this story will take you into the heart of Alfred Nobel himself. And before we begin, if you love journeys that explore the soul behind history, subscribe so you won't miss the next story that may change how you see the world, just as Alfred changed his twice. Chapter 1. The Boy Surrounded by Explosions. Before he was a name engraved on medals of gold, Alfred Nobel was just a quiet boy, a boy who grew up listening to the sound of explosions. Stockholm, Sweden, 1833. In a small wooden house filled with blueprints, fumes, and unfinished dreams, young Alfred watched his father, Emanuel Nobel, bent over a workbench. Sparks flew, gears turned, and somewhere, another experiment failed with a muffled bang. The air smelled of oil and ambition. Emanuel was a man haunted by invention. He dreamed of machines that could move mountains, of weapons that could make nations safe. Yet, success always seemed to slip away just as he reached for it. One bankruptcy after another, one explosion too many. For little Alfred, that was childhood. A mixture of fire, failure, and fascination. He wasn't like other children. While others played in the streets, Alfred wandered through his father's workshop, studying metal fragments and glass vials, whispering to himself, "Why does it work this way? What happens if?" He was not afraid of silence. He was afraid of not knowing. From his earliest days, curiosity was his closest friend, and loneliness his shadow. When the family moved to St. Petersburg, Russia, Emmanuel finally found fortune building weapons for the Tsar. The Nobel's fortunes rose, and for the first time, Alfred saw what success looked like. He was given tutors, books, and languages. He devoured knowledge like others devoured bread. By 16, he spoke 5 languages: Swedish, Russian, French, English, and German, and read poetry in all of them. Yet his heart belonged not to words, but to chemistry. In his notebooks, he drew tiny sketches of flasks and reactions, often accompanied by fragments of poetry. Science, to him, was not a cold pursuit. It was art, painted in fire and transformation. "Home is where I work," he once said, "and I work everywhere." In 1850, Alfred was sent to Paris to study under the great chemist Théophile Jules Pelouse. There he met Ascanio Sobrero, the man who had discovered nitroglycerin, a liquid so unstable that even a drop could explode with the lightest touch. Sobrero called it too dangerous, too unpredictable. But to Alfred, danger was not the enemy. It was the mystery waiting to be mastered. Still, he understood the tragedy behind it. He saw fear in Sobrero's eyes when he spoke of his own creation, the mixture of pride and shame. It fascinated Alfred. Perhaps, even then, he recognized a mirror of his own future. When Alfred returned home, he found his family's fortune once again crumbling. The Tsar's contracts ended, and the Nobel's empire fell apart. Back in Stockholm, poverty returned, but so did purpose. In a small shed by the river, Alfred began his own experiments with nitroglycerin. The neighbors whispered that he was mad. His family begged him to stop. But Alfred had seen too much to give up now. He believed there was a way to tame the explosion, to transform chaos into creation. Late into the night, he worked by candlelight. His hands trembled. His eyes burned. Every test tube was a conversation with danger. Every reaction was a gamble between discovery and death. And yet, when he watched the violent shimmer of nitroglycerin in the glass, he didn't see destruction. He saw possibility. He saw a way to move the earth, to carve tunnels, build bridges, connect cities. He saw a tool for progress. But behind that dream was something deeper, something unspoken. Perhaps it was the shadow of his father's failures. Perhaps it was the loneliness of genius. Or perhaps, even then, Alfred Nobel was trying to prove to himself that from pain, something beautiful could still be born. He would later write, "I am not a man of war, but of work. My greatest wish is to be useful, to leave something that matters." The boy who grew up surrounded by explosions had learned one thing: creation and destruction were not opposites. They were brothers, born from the same spark. And Alfred Nobel would spend the rest of his life trying to choose which one he would serve. Chapter 2: The Wanderer of Science. By his early 20s, Alfred Nobel was already a traveler, not of lands, but of ideas. He carried no map, no compass. His only direction was curiosity. Wherever there was a laboratory, a library, or a man with knowledge to share, Alfred would find his way there. He moved like the wind across Europe. Stockholm, St. Petersburg, Paris, London, Hamburg, never staying long enough to belong, yet always leaving behind the scent of chemicals and ink. To most, he seemed restless. To Alfred, he was simply alive. "Home is my laboratory," he once wrote, "and my laboratory is the world." In Paris, the city of science and art, he found himself enchanted. Here, minds burned brighter than any flame. He studied under the renowned chemist Théophile Jules Pelouse, whose lab was a temple for young dreamers of discovery. But it wasn't Pelouse who changed Alfred's life. It was one of Pelouse's assistants, Ascanio Sobrero. Sobrero was quiet, cautious, perhaps even fearful. He had created something extraordinary: nitroglycerin. A clear, trembling liquid that could shatter rock with the lightest touch. He called it a curse. Alfred saw it as a challenge. When Sobrero demonstrated its terrifying power, the explosion cracked through the walls and left smoke curling in the air like a ghost. Students gasped. Others fled. Alfred stayed. His eyes didn't show fear, only fascination. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Every force that can destroy also holds the power to build. The question is not in the force, but in the hands that use it." For the next few years, Alfred drifted between laboratories and languages. He read philosophy at dawn, poetry at night, and mixed chemicals in between. He admired Byron and Shelley, men who turned emotion into words. He wanted to do the same, but with matter. Sometimes he would spend days without speaking, lost in his thoughts, filling his notebooks with formulas that few could understand. But in those scribbles lay the beginning of what would one day make him one of the most famous and misunderstood men on Earth. Yet, for all his brilliance, Alfred was not made for comfort. He was often sick, migraines, chest pain, exhaustion. He slept little and ate less. Friends described him as a man with a heart too big for his body. And behind his intellectual fire burned something gentler, a longing for belonging. Letters to his family reveal a tone of quiet sadness. "I wander from one country to another," he wrote, "but I am nowhere at home." It was true. The more he learned, the less he felt he belonged anywhere. He was Swedish, but also Russian by upbringing, French by education, and cosmopolitan by spirit. He belonged to knowledge and to solitude. In the mid-1850s, Europe was changing. Railways stretched across the continent, tunnels cut through mountains, cities pulsed with steam and ambition. But building the modern world required one thing above all: a safe way to harness explosive power. Alfred knew that answer might lie inside that trembling drop of nitroglycerin. He began experimenting with ways to stabilize it, to control its fury. He mixed it with other materials, encased it, observed it. Sometimes the mixture hissed. Sometimes it whispered. And sometimes it roared. His fingers blistered. His clothes caught fire, yet his faith never did. "I am not afraid of failure," he said, "only of not trying enough." He believed that science was not a pursuit of perfection, but a dialogue with danger. Each explosion was not defeat, but a lesson in humility. When he finally returned to Sweden to work beside his father, the years abroad had changed him. He was no longer just the inventor's son. He was his own scientist, driven not by profit, but by purpose. And though he did not know it yet, the restless wanderer who once drifted through laboratories and languages was now standing on the threshold of destiny. Soon, the liquid that had terrified his teacher would become the foundation of his fortune and the source of his greatest torment. Alfred Nobel had wandered far and wide in search of knowledge. But what he would soon discover was that every explosion has two echoes. One that shakes the earth, and another that shakes the soul.
Chapter 3. The Birth of Dynamite. It began with a trembling vial, a drop of clear liquid, beautiful, almost innocent, resting in a glass tube. Yet Alfred Nobel knew that inside it slept a storm. One wrong move and it would all vanish in a flash of fire and thunder. To most people, nitroglycerin was madness bottled up. To Alfred, it was a riddle, a force so dangerous it demanded to be understood. He believed, perhaps naively, that every destructive power could be transformed into creation, if only one could learn its language. So he listened. Day after day, night after night, in a small shed by the river in Stockholm, he mixed, cooled, measured, and waited. He was joined by a few loyal assistants, and his younger brother, Emil. They were careful, but the air always smelled of danger. Neighbors called it the House of Explosions. Sometimes the windows rattled at dawn. Sometimes the experiments ended in smoke and silence. But Alfred would simply dust off his coat and begin again. To invent is to risk one's life, he said. But not to invent is to risk one's soul. Nitroglycerine fascinated and terrified him. It was unpredictable, sensitive to heat, shock, even touch. He tried everything, mixing it with sawdust, coal dust, chalk. Then, one day while working near a lake, he noticed something strange. A small amount of nitroglycerin had spilled onto the ground and mixed with a type of porous clay called kieselguhr. To his surprise, it stopped trembling. It became stable, safe to handle. That moment, simple, quiet, accidental, changed the world. By blending nitroglycerin with that earth-like substance, Alfred created a material that was powerful, yet controllable. He called it dynamite, from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power. The very thing he had spent his life chasing, fearing, and trying to understand. At first, the world didn't believe him. No one trusted explosives. Governments banned them, neighbors complained, newspapers mocked him. But then engineers and miners began to see what dynamite could do. It could cut through mountains, dig canals, and build railways faster than ever before. For the first time in history, human hands could move the earth itself. Bridges rose where cliffs once stood. Tunnels stretched through the Alps. The world was expanding, and Alfred Nobel had given it the means to do so. He was hailed as a genius, a modern Prometheus who had stolen the fire of the gods. But even fire brings shadows. One morning in 1864, tragedy struck. Alfred's laboratory in Stockholm exploded. A deafening blast that shattered windows across the city. When the smoke cleared, 5 men were dead, including his brother, Emil. Alfred arrived moments later. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He stood in the ruins, his coat flapping in the wind, his face pale with disbelief. The world called it an accident, but for Alfred, it was something deeper, a wound that would never truly heal. He rebuilt the lab. He continued his work, but something inside him had changed. Each experiment was now a prayer, a plea for redemption. Each invention, an attempt to make peace with what he had unleashed. He would often sit alone at his desk long after midnight, staring at a candle's flame. "I wish," he wrote, "that I could invent something that would end all wars, that would make men afraid to fight." As dynamite spread across continents, Alfred's fortune grew. He built factories, filed patents, and hired hundreds of workers. Yet wealth brought him no joy. He never married, never settled. His home was still his laboratory, and his companions were silence and guilt. People saw him as cold, distant, a man obsessed with work. But inside, he was a storm of contradictions, a dreamer, a scientist, a man trying to save the world from the very power he had given it. In time, dynamite became both his crown and his curse. He had given humanity a tool for creation and destruction. Each explosion that carved a railway through rock also carved a scar through his conscience. He had discovered the most powerful substance known to man. But in doing so, he had also discovered the fragility of his own soul. Alfred Nobel had changed the world once, with fire and invention. But deep down, he knew his greatest creation was also his greatest sin. And somewhere, beneath the echo of every explosion, a new question began to burn inside him. Could he ever create something that would heal instead of harm? Chapter 4. The Shadow of Guilt. The lab was silent, except for the faint hiss of gas and the soft ticking of a clock. Alfred Nobel stood alone, staring at a small glass vial on his workbench. Inside, nitroglycerin shimmered like liquid fire. Beautiful, dangerous, and alive. He had done it. He had turned chaos into something useful, and the world rewarded him for it. Bridges rose faster, mines went deeper, mountains cracked open at a whisper of his invention. From Sweden to California, dynamite was everywhere, in the hands of builders, miners, and soldiers. At first, Alfred tried not to notice. He told himself he was a man of science, not war. His purpose was progress, not bloodshed. But then came the letters. They arrived from across Europe, engineers thanking him for the convenience of his creation, and generals praising him for the same reason. He began to realize that every bridge his dynamite built could also be destroyed by it. And soon, that realization began to haunt him. One evening, as he walked along the Seine River in Paris, he saw a newspaper boy shouting the day's headlines. "Explosion kills dozens in quarry accident." He bought a copy. His hands trembled as he read. It was his product. His name was mentioned. The article praised dynamite for its efficiency, even in tragedy. That night, Alfred couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, the lamp flickering, his face pale and drawn. He began writing in his journal, the ink trembling with every stroke. "I thought I had created a servant of progress," he wrote. "But perhaps I have only given mankind a more efficient way to destroy itself." The following years turned him into a restless traveler. He moved constantly. Paris, Stockholm, Hamburg, San Remo, unable to stay still. Everywhere he went, he saw the mark of dynamite. Tunnels, canals, and fortresses. It was as if his invention had spread like wildfire, and he could no longer control where it burned. He tried to focus on new experiments: smokeless gunpowder, synthetic rubber, artificial silk, anything to feel creative again. But the smell of sulfur clung to him, invisible and inescapable. People called him the Dynamite King. He smiled for the photographs, accepted the honors, attended banquets, but behind every toast, he felt the echo of an explosion. He began to avoid people altogether. He disliked parties, detested fame. His wealth grew, but his circle of trust shrank. Even his friends noticed the change, the faraway look in his eyes, the way he paused before answering, as if weighing the moral cost of every word. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would recall his childhood in Stockholm. The boy who played with sparks, the boy who dreamed of invention, not destruction. What would that boy think of him now? He tried to comfort himself with logic. Progress demands sacrifice, he told himself. Every invention carries risk. But conscience has a way of speaking louder than reason, especially at night. He began writing poetry, private verses he never showed anyone, lives that sounded less like science and more like sorrow. "My heart is full of wounds that will not heal. I have made light, yet I walk in By the 1880s, Alfred Nobel was one of the richest men in Europe. Yet he lived like a recluse, surrounded not by friends or family, but by books, experiments, and silence. He once told a colleague, "I might as well be buried alive in my laboratories. I am not a man. I am a machine for making money from explosions." His laughter afterwards sounded hollow, even to himself. One winter night, he stood before the mirror in his Paris apartment. The man looking back at him was no longer young. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, were dimmed by exhaustion. He whispered to his reflection, "What have I truly given the world?" The question lingered in the cold air, unanswered. And though he didn't yet know it, that same question would one day lead him to rewrite his destiny, to transform the legacy of death into a promise of peace. But not yet. For now, Alfred Nobel remained trapped in his own creation, a man haunted by the shadow of guilt, walking alone through the quiet ruins of his genius. Chapter 5. A Lonely Heart. He was one of the richest men in Europe. He owned factories in more than 20 countries, held over 300 patents, and employed thousands. And yet, Alfred Nobel, the man who had changed the world, ate most of his dinners alone. His wealth could buy silence, but not peace. His fame could fill newspapers, but never the empty room he called home. Those who met him often described a contradiction, a man of immense intellect but delicate soul, polite, kind, but distant, as if his thoughts were always somewhere else, wandering among unfinished inventions and unspoken regrets. "I am a misanthrope," he once wrote, "and yet utterly benevolent, hopelessly hopeful." He longed to be understood, but he didn't know how to let anyone close enough to try. It was during one of his stays in Paris that Alfred met Sophia Hess, a young Austrian flower seller, barely in her 20s. She was spirited, curious, and far less impressed by his wealth than others were. Where others saw a solemn scientist, she saw a lonely man who needed warmth. They exchanged letters, hundreds of them, over the next 2 decades. In them, Alfred was not the inventor or the industrialist. He was simply a man, uncertain, yearning, tender. He wrote to her of books and music, of life and loneliness, of the strange ache that success could never cure. "You say I should laugh more," he told her once. "But laughter without reason is like a machine without motion. It rusts." She called him Alfrede. He called her Sophieton. For a time it seemed she had unlocked something gentle inside him. But love, like nitroglycerin, can be unstable. The relationship was not easy. Sophia was young, impulsive. Alfred was older, withdrawn, and perpetually busy. He sent her money, gifts, even arranged for her education, gestures of care that often replaced the affection he didn't know how to express in person. Distance grew. Misunderstandings multiplied. Her letters became colder, his more desperate. He confessed in one, "My heart feels like my laboratories, full of smoke and broken glass." He wanted connection, but feared dependence. He wanted love, but could not live without solitude. It was as if he had built walls so high to protect himself from disappointment that he could no longer see over them. In the quiet of his study, Alfred surrounded himself with his inventions, things that obeyed, that did not disappoint. But even machines seemed to echo his melancholy. He once wrote, half in jest, "My best friends are my explosives. They never argue, only react." Yet beneath the humor was truth. He was a man who could command the forces of nature,
yet not the longings of his own heart. His servants often found him sitting in the dark, a candle burning beside half-finished papers, as if afraid to fully enter the light. In the margins of one document, he scribbled a small verse. I love, yet am unloved. I give, yet remain empty. Perhaps I was meant to build bridges for others, not to cross one myself. When Sophie eventually left his life, Alfred did not rage or weep. He simply grew quieter. He continued to write to her from time to time, not to rekindle, but to remember. In one of his last letters, he signed off, "May you find happiness in a world I never managed to live in." That was his way, always turning pain into thought, thought into invention, and invention into legacy. But even as the world saw him as a man of brilliance, he remained, deep down, a soul adrift, a heart that beat alone in rooms filled with applause. And yet, perhaps, loneliness was part of his destiny. Without it, he might never have looked so deeply into himself, never questioned what truly gave life meaning. For in the silence of his solitude, Alfred Nobel was preparing to create something far greater than dynamite, a force not of destruction, but of redemption. Chapter 6: The Awakening of Conscience. Paris, 1888. The newspaper headline screamed in bold black letters, "The Merchant of Death is dead." Alfred Nobel froze. For a moment, he thought he might be dreaming, but no, it was real. His brother Ludwig had died in Cannes, and the French press had mistaken the deceased for him. The obituary was meant for Alfred. Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. He read it again and again. Each line felt like a nail driven into the coffin of his conscience. This was how the world saw him, not as a thinker, not as a dreamer, not as a man who sought progress through science, but as a merchant of death. For hours, he sat in silence, the paper trembling in his hands. He had always known his invention, dynamite, could be used for war. But he had hoped, desperately, that humanity would use it for peace, for mining, for construction, for progress. Now he saw how naive that hope had been. His creation had become an instrument of destruction. And his name, once linked to innovation, now whispered like a curse across battlefields. Alfred Nobel, the man who made killing easier. He looked out the window. The Paris sky was grey, heavy. For the first time in years, he felt afraid. Not of death, but of how he would be remembered. That night, Alfred opened his journal and began to write, his words uncertain at first, then flowing like confession. I wish to be remembered for something other than my inventions. Something that brings people together, not tears them apart. He had spent his life mastering the chemistry of explosions. But now, he sought the chemistry of peace. He wanted to transform guilt into purpose, destruction into hope. But how does one undo a legacy written in gunpowder? He pondered this for months, traveling between his homes in Paris, San Remo, and Stockholm. Each journey deepened his solitude, but also his clarity. He began drafting what would become the most important document of his life: his will. He wrote in secret, fearing ridicule or interference. In those pages, he outlined a vision that seemed almost absurd for its time: that his vast fortune should not go to heirs or governments, but instead be used to reward those who benefited humanity the most: scientists, writers, peacemakers, people who healed rather than harmed. He wrote, "The whole of my remaining estate shall be invested to create prizes for those who have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind. 5 fields: physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. Each one a silent apology, each prize a seed of redemption." When he confided his plan to a few trusted friends, they thought he was mad. Why give away everything he had built? Why reward others instead of securing his family's wealth or his own memory? He simply smiled. "Because my memory," he said softly, "is already written in explosions. I wish to rewrite it in peace." In his final years, Alfred Nobel grew frailer, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to work, to write, to perfect his will. In 1895, in a small Swedish-Norwegian club in Paris, he signed the document that would forever change his legacy. No grand ceremony, no witnesses beyond a few clerks, just a quiet man with tired eyes signing away a fortune and rewriting history. When he finally put down the pen, he whispered to himself, "Now, perhaps, they will say I tried to make peace as powerfully as I made war." It was not guilt that drove him anymore, but purpose, a deep, calm resolve to balance the scales of his life. And in that moment, Alfred Nobel, the man who gave the world dynamite, discovered something far more powerful: the explosion of a conscience reborn. Chapter 7: The Birth of a Legacy. Stockholm, 1896. The winter air was crisp, the streets quiet under a thin layer of snow. Inside a modest apartment, Alfred Nobel lay in bed, frail and pale. Years of experiments, travel, and contemplation had left him weakened, yet his mind remained sharp, alive, and restless. He had lived with explosions, literal and metaphorical, all his life. He had witnessed bridges rise and mountains fall, cities flourish and wars rage, fortunes made and lives lost. And now, he understood the final truth. The greatest force a man could leave behind was not wealth, not invention, not fame. It was hope. Alfred spent his last months meticulously revising his will. Every word, every clause was deliberate.
He wanted to ensure that the world would remember him not as the man who invented dynamite, but as the man who sought to honor humanity's greatest achievements. He wrote, "The whole of my remaining estate shall be invested to create prizes to those who, during the preceding year, shall have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind." 5 categories: physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace, were chosen not at random, but with intention. They reflected his own obsessions and regrets, the power of discovery, the beauty of expression, the pursuit of knowledge, and, above all, the longing for peace. Each prize was a quiet apology. Each medal a chance to remind the world that human creativity and compassion could outshine even the most destructive force. He entrusted the execution of his will to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the Swedish Academy, and the Norwegian Nobel Committee, institutions he believed could uphold his vision with integrity. He imagined the ceremonies decades later, where men and women would stand before the world to be recognized, not for wealth, not for conquest, but for service, for thought, for healing. Perhaps in this way, he wrote in his journal, "My life will be remembered not for the explosions I caused, but for the good I inspired." Even in those quiet moments, alone with his thoughts, Alfred felt a faint, fragile peace. News of his death in December 1896 traveled slowly across Europe. The world knew him as a wealthy industrialist, the inventor of dynamite, a man whose creations had shaped both commerce and war. Few understood the man who had labored in solitude to transform guilt into legacy. And yet, over the years, the Nobel Prizes became far greater than any single invention, any fortune, or any headline. The awards recognized courage, creativity, and wisdom, the very qualities Alfred had longed to foster. His name, once associated with destruction, now became synonymous with honor, achievement, and hope. In a quiet reflection near the end, he wrote, "I have lived with the shadow of my own inventions, and yet I leave behind a light. If my life teaches anything, let it be that conscience can guide even the most flawed man toward a better path." Alfred Nobel, the solitary wanderer of science, had finally found a way to make peace with himself. The shadows of guilt that had haunted him decades earlier were softened, not erased, by his final act of vision and generosity. He had transformed his remorse into a gift for the world, and in doing so, he created something far more lasting than dynamite, far more enduring than wealth. A legacy that would illuminate human achievement for generations to come. Long after his passing, children would read about him in textbooks. Scientists would honor him in labs. Writers and poets would stand on stages, clutching medals that bore his name. And somewhere in the quiet corners of memory, Alfred Nobel, the boy who had once played among sparks, the man who had wrestled with explosions and conscience, would finally be remembered as he wished. Not for destruction, but for hope, for vision, for humanity. Chapter 8. The Final Reflections. San Remo, Italy, 1896. The Mediterranean sun spilled softly through the windows, warming the quiet room where Alfred Nobel lay in his final days. Outside, palm fronds swayed in the gentle breeze, carrying the distant sound of waves. Inside, there was only stillness, a rare companion to the restless mind that had once roamed laboratories, libraries, and battlefields across Europe. He had spent a lifetime chasing knowledge, mastering fire, and confronting the consequences of his own inventions. Now, he faced the most profound experiment of all, life itself, and the meaning he would leave behind. In these quiet moments, Alfred reflected on the paradoxes that had shaped him. He had sought to give mankind tools for progress, and yet, in doing so, had unleashed tools of destruction. He had accumulated immense wealth, and yet his heart often felt empty. He had wandered the world in search of knowledge, and yet he had longed for the simple warmth of human connection. One can measure a man not by his discoveries, he wrote in a journal now yellowed with age, but by the conscience he brings to them. He remembered the headlines that had haunted him. The Merchant of Death. And he understood that the weight of a legacy is not decided by the creator alone, but by the eyes of the world. Yet, amid the shadow of guilt and solitude, he found a quiet truth. Power and invention are neither inherently good nor evil. It is the hand that wields them, and the heart that guides them, that defines their impact. Alfred's greatest invention, he realized, was not dynamite. It was the principle that conscience can shape action, and that action can shape the world. He thought of the Nobel Prizes, the future recipients, and the message they would carry. That human endeavor, guided by wisdom and compassion, can overcome the shadow of destruction and transform society for the better. Even in his solitude, he felt a fragile hope. He recalled the faces of those he had loved and lost, the boyhood curiosity nurtured by his father, the fleeting tenderness of Sophia Hess, the friends who had walked beside him for moments in time. Each memory was a spark, a reminder of what it meant to be human. And in them, he understood that invention alone does not define a life. It is the reflection, intention, and care behind it that endure. I have seen the world's capacity for both brilliance and cruelty, he wrote, but I choose to leave a light for those who come after me. In the final days, Alfred spoke little. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, felt the gentle pulse of the sea, and thought of the generations who would never know the weight he had carried. He had learned that greatness is inseparable from responsibility, and that conscience, once awakened, can outshine even the most destructive force. He imagined a future where science, literature, and peace would be celebrated, where recognition would honor those who lift humanity rather than tear it down. He pictured a world transformed not by explosions, but by insight, compassion, and courage.
As the candlelight flickered and the shadows stretched across the room, Alfred Nobel's reflections crystallized into a quiet serenity. He had lived a life of contradiction, brilliance and guilt, creation and destruction, solitude and longing. But through it all, he had sought to guide the world toward a better path. And in that pursuit, he discovered the most enduring truth. A man's legacy is not measured by what he makes, but by the conscience with which he makes it. The boy who once played among sparks, the man who wrestled with fire, and the solitary thinker who had feared the weight of his own name, had finally found a measure of peace. And with that, Alfred Nobel's mind rested, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the centuries, illuminating the path from darkness to hope. Chapter 9. The Flame That Never Dies. The world had changed since Alfred Nobel's final days. Cities stretched higher, bridges spanned wider rivers, and laboratories hummed with the ceaseless pulse of discovery. And yet, through all this progress, one legacy burned quietly, persistently, like a small but unyielding flame: the Nobel Prizes. They were not merely awards. They were symbols of conscience, vision, and the belief that human achievement could be measured not by power, but by service to others. Each year, when the winners were announced, newspapers around the globe carried stories of innovation, courage, and compassion. Physicists unveiling the secrets of the universe, writers illuminating the human soul, doctors saving lives, and peacemakers striving to end conflict, all guided in some small way by the quiet wisdom of a man who had once wrestled with the consequences of his own genius. "I have not lived for fame," Nobel had written. "But perhaps, through understanding and conscience, one can leave a mark that outlasts a lifetime." The words rang truer with each passing decade. Alfred's vision had transcended the years. The explosion of guilt that had haunted him in Paris, the lonely nights in San Remo, the letters to Sophie Hesse, all of it had been transformed into something enduring, something beyond death. Where once his name had evoked fear, it now inspired hope. Where once he had worried about being remembered as a merchant of death, he had become a guardian of human achievement. And in that transformation, there was a lesson for the world. Even the most troubled conscience can give rise to beauty, meaning, and purpose. In distant laboratories, Nobel laureates worked tirelessly. In lecture halls, writers and thinkers shared ideas that would shape generations. In peace negotiations, leaders sought solutions to conflicts that had once seemed endless. All carried a spark of Nobel's enduring belief that knowledge, compassion, and courage can illuminate even the darkest corners of the human experience. The flame he had lit, not of fire, but of conscience, could not be extinguished. Across time and continents, millions would read about him, speak of him, and be inspired by him. Children studying chemistry, physics, literature, or history might never know the full story of the man behind the prizes. Yet they would carry his legacy nonetheless. And perhaps that was exactly what Alfred Nobel had hoped for. A quiet influence that moves invisibly through generations, guiding action, inspiring minds, and nurturing the better angels of humanity. Life is not measured by what we gain, but by what we give, he might have said. And in giving, Alfred had found immortality. His laboratories may have fallen silent, and his hands would never again shape the world with dynamite. Yet the light he had kindled continued to shine, brighter with each year, each discovery, each act of courage and wisdom. Alfred Nobel's flame had become eternal. It was a testament not to the explosions he had mastered, but to the conscience he had awakened and the hope he had gifted to the world. Chapter 10: The Paradox of Genius. Alfred Nobel's life was a study in contrasts. A man who harnessed the most powerful forces of nature, yet wrestled constantly with the power of conscience. A solitary genius whose inventions could both build nations and destroy them. A heart that longed for connection, yet found meaning in ideas and vision rather than companionship. He gave the world dynamite, a tool of immense power. And then, through reflection and remorse, he gave humanity a gift far greater: the Nobel Prizes. A legacy that reminds us that brilliance alone is never enough. It is guided conscience, compassion, and purpose that define the true measure of a life. Even today, his story resonates. Every physicist pushing the boundaries of the universe, every writer illuminating the human soul, every peacemaker striving for harmony, they are, in a sense, carrying forward Nobel's quiet hope. And maybe that is the greatest paradox of genius. The same mind capable of creation and destruction can also inspire hope across centuries. If you've been inspired by Alfred Nobel's journey, by his brilliance, his struggles, and his vision, don't forget to join us on this journey of discovery. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that explores the lives of extraordinary minds who shaped our world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of Nobel's life surprised you the most? And if you want to explore more stories like this, check out our playlist on historical visionaries. Because every life, no matter how complicated, carries lessons for all of us. And Alfred Nobel's lesson is clear. Even the weight of guilt can be transformed into a flame that never dies.